For centuries, Chinese dynasties had engaged in battles with Western powers, and for a long time no European was able to penetrate Chinese territory. The first battle between the Chinese and a European power was in 1552, when the Portuguese were humiliated by the Ming dynasty. Portuguese pirates such as Simão de Andrade began buying Chinese slaves and selling them to the Mughals in India. The Portuguese also built forts on Chinese territory. All of these illegal activities were done without the consent of the Ming authorities, who soon kicked them out and defeated them at the Battle of Shankiawan. This is an example of how dominant and powerful China was for centuries. After the Portuguese were defeated, no other European power dared to invade China or conduct piracy on Chinese shores for the next few centuries. The very few Dutch and Portuguese pirates that tried to conduct illegal activities in Chinese waters were humiliated, and in one case, in 1857, the Cantonese authorities butchered 40 Portuguese pirates who were harassing locals in the town of Ningpo. However, during the 17 and 1800s, European powers such as the British began to develop advanced weaponry. In the 1800s, the British East India Company began illegally smuggling opium, which was produced in their Indian colony, into China. And soon, corrupt Qing dynasty officials began collaborating with the British. Opium addiction in China was out of control, and opium smoking was widespread to the extent that many high-ranking government officials were addicted to opium. It was not long before the British drug cartels were confronted by the Chinese. Various influential scholars of the Qing dynasty court began a campaign to completely eradicate opium smuggling and opium smoking in China. Scholars such as Wei Yuan, Lin Zexu, Huang Juezi, Tao Zhu, and Bao Shen wrote extensively about the horrific effects of opium on Chinese society and resisted the increasing European influence in China. In 1837, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu as the commissioner in charge of ending the opium trade at Canton. In 1839, after failed attempts at diplomacy, Lin Zexu began arresting British opium smugglers and corrupt Chinese officials who collaborated with the British. In June of the same year, 1,000 tons of illegal British opium was confiscated and thrown into the sea. The British were furious and demanded compensation for their lost opium. Lin Zexu refused to provide any compensation and stood his ground. Therefore, the British declared war on China. This war came to be known as the Opium War, and was a disaster for the Chinese, who were overwhelmed by the technologically advanced British Navy. The Treaty of Nanking of 1842 concluded the Opium War, with the Qing government reversing their decision over the import of the drug. The treaty also cost the Chinese treasury dearly with the Qing negotiators agreeing to pay the British $21 million over a 3-year period. This payment included $12 million in war reparations and $3 million in compensation for loss of trade to British businessmen. Furthermore, the Europeans, led by the British, now knew that the Qing dynasty could be coerced or bullied into agreeing to their demands for trading rights. The British were also granted control of the port of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong became a base for the Western imperialist invasion of China in the 1800s. The Second Opium War culminated in the summer of 1860 with the total humiliation of China. At the end of the war, an Anglo-French force took Tianjin and marched to Beijing. The emperor fled the capital as Lord Elgin's troops looted and destroyed the palaces. British and French troops looted and then burnt the imperial buildings in the Yuanmingguan in the north of Beijing. This widespread destruction of China's most important complex of palaces and the dispersal of the important imperial art collection is considered one of the most extreme acts of cultural destruction of the 19th century. Over 1 million objects are estimated to have been looted from the buildings in the Yuanmingguan. Like the unequal treaties before and after it, the ensuing Treaty of Tianjin provided Western nations with huge benefits and no obligations. The treaties crippled China but gave missionaries access to China, revoking the ban on Christianity and allowing missionaries to build homes, churches, schools, and hospitals in China. After the end of the Second Opium War, the Qing dynasty was forced to legalize opium, and opium production increased dramatically. The Second Opium War brought China to its knees, leaving its people addicted to opium and incapable of resisting subsequent waves of European, American, and Japanese colonizers. However, Chinese resistance continued even after the Second Opium War. It was not long before anti-British violence broke out in Hong Kong. In 1858, Governor General Yi ordered the Chinese of Hong Kong and Canton not to cooperate, offering rewards in silver for each English head delivered to him. Placards on street corners throughout Canton and Hong Kong called on all loyal Chinese to rise up against the English barbarians by poisoning or stabbing them or by burning their property. European factories in Canton were burnt down, several European steamships were captured in Chinese waters, their passengers murdered, and in Hong Kong, the buildings of several European firms were attacked, and a government official was strangled by one of his servants. During the same year, the Chinese crew of a British steamship which carried mail from Hong Kong to Canton rebelled while the ship was en route and beheaded all 11 European passengers with the help of Chinese soldiers who had disguised themselves as passengers. At the turn of the 20th century, the Chinese people were proud of their long and illustrious history, but dismayed and humiliated by their country's domination by the European powers over the latter half of the 19th century. Influential members of Chinese society were increasingly looking for a way to challenge Europeans. The Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1850s had led to Western nations imposing on the Chinese what became known as the Unequal Treaties, which gave them substantial control over China's principal ports, domination of the Chinese customs service, and extraterrestrial rights for Western citizens, rendering them immune from persecution in Chinese courts. This environment provided Western businessmen a dominant position in the most lucrative parts of the Chinese economy, and also encouraged the influx of Christian missionaries, who came to be seen as agents for the further spread of Western influence in China. In the year 1897, a huge rebellion broke out against European invaders. The Boxer Rebellion was initiated by the secret organization known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known in the West as the Boxers, during the late Qing dynasty. The movement developed in northern China, and the Boxer Rebellion occurred from November 1897 to September 1901. Its objective was the removal of foreign influence over the Chinese trade, politics, religion, and technology. Although the rebellion was initiated by a religious peasant organization that practiced martial arts, the rebellion soon gained support across all of China. Eventually, the Qing dynasty also began to support the rebellion. This was a move of desperation in order to rally support for the crumbling dynasty. However, many Chinese intellectuals at the time openly disagreed with the rebels and Qing officials who supported the rebellion. For example, Liu Yi, who was a civil servant and scholar, stated that aggression will not strengthen China against foreign encroachment, and criticized corrupt Qing officials such as Yu Xuan, who supported the rebellion but in reality did not care about the problems facing the common people and peasants. In other words, Qing officials only supported the rebellion for their own fame, power, and status. Liu Yi also stated that instead of supporting armed revolts, the government should have instead invested in technology and industry to defend itself against foreign aggression. As a result of his open criticisms of the Qing dynasty, Liu was exiled to Xinjiang, where he continued to write about the problems that common people faced in China. Eventually, the Boxer Rebellion began to lose support from the Chinese population because of the large-scale violence against Chinese civilians and the mass killings of Chinese Christians. China reached its lowest point in modern history in the year 1900, when an international expedition force marched on Beijing on a punitive expedition to suppress the Boxer uprising, and as a result occupied the imperial palace, driving the court into exile at Xi'an. The Qing dynasty was clearly in a state of decay and had proved itself incapable of defending the Chinese people against foreign powers. In 1911, the Chinese people were fed up with the extreme level of corruption in the Qing dynasty and its closeness to European powers. Therefore, in 1911, the Chinese overthrew the Qing dynasty entirely. However, a civil war soon followed. The civil war in China from 1927 to 1949 was a result of the fall of the monarchy system in 1912. Without a structured form of government, the country was in chaos. Warlords, military men who controlled specific regions of China, were vying for power and had taken over the country. This weak and divided China allowed Japan to invade China in 1931. The Chinese people bravely defended themselves against the Japanese. However, division made them weak, and by this time Chinese culture began to fade away and Western influence found its way back into China. Although Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek were determined to oust foreign powers such as Japan, both of their ideologies were based on Western ideas. During this period, there were still many intellectuals who wanted China to regain its sovereignty while still maintaining ancient Chinese cultural values. For example, Carson Chang, opposed to the Chinese communists but also dissatisfied with Chiang Kai-shek's non-compliance with the constitution, fled to the United States after 1949. After coming to power, Mao Zedong was determined to destroy Chinese culture and was determined to design a new China based on the Western ideology of communism. Anyone who opposed him was killed or imprisoned. The Chinese poet Wang Shiwei was assassinated by Mao early on during his rectification campaign. Later on, during the Cultural Revolution, many others who wanted to bring back Chinese culture were silenced. For example, Lao She, who was a fierce critic of Western philosophies such as Marxism, was paraded by the Red Guards through the streets and beaten publicly at the doorsteps of the Temple of Confucius in Beijing. Furthermore, many other critics of Mao were exiled to the desert in Xinjiang. For example, Chinese intellectual A. Qing was exiled to Xinjiang. In 1974, the great Chinese scholar Liang Xiuming refused to become a propagandist for the CCP and was therefore alienated by the public. Today, Chinese culture is often associated with communism and the Communist Party of China. However, a deeper look into Chinese history will reveal that China has a rich history of defending their ancient culture against European powers and Western immorality. In my personal opinion, people like Mao Zedong or Chiang Kai-shek were not true Chinese patriots, whereas figures such as Lin Zexu were figures who were immensely proud of their Chinese culture and fought to preserve the Chinese way as it was fading away at the hands of Western powers.